So at the beginning of each year, we take a look at our commitment to simplicity. And the question that we ask with this commitment is really simple. Is my relationship with food, clothing, technology, and possessions, is this a relationship that feels simple or one that feels complex? And if I notice a complex relationship in one or more of these areas, is there anything in these areas where I sense God inviting me to move towards more simplicity? So at the center of all of our questions around simplicity in these areas is really a deeper question about desire. And the monastic tradition teaches us that the fact that we have desires is good. And so we're not trying to become stoics, and we're not trying to shut down our desires or lessen their effect on us. The problem isn't that we have desires or even that we have strong desires. Like, there are some things that we ought to strongly desire. Justice, for example. We ought to strongly desire justice for the poor. We ought to strongly desire that our kids come to know and follow Jesus, or that our work feels meaningful in some way, or that our friendships grow in intimacy and vulnerability. So friends, strong desire is really good to have. And a counterpart to strong desire is what the ancient folks called thumos, or resistance. So sometimes resistance is good. Like all this conversation we've talked about related to spiritual training and asceticism, it's actually good to resist some things. And so for me, one of the things that is good for me to resist is this urge that I have to work past 6 p.m. when I have told my family that I would be home for a 6:30 dinner. I have to resist my urge to just keep working. And so we have desire and we have resistance. And going all the way back to the earliest part of our monastic tradition, desire and resistance play a role in our formation. So desire, rightly ordered, was meant to fuel love for God and neighbor. And resistance, it was really the capacity to resist evil and injustice. And so we need our desires to be free in order to move us towards God and love of neighbor. And we need our resistance muscles to push back against things that are not good for us and the things that are not good for other people. So friends, our commitment to simplicity and to have a relationship with food, clothing, technology, and possessions be a simple relationship is another way of saying this. If our relationship with these things is a complex one, if, for example, we find that we struggle to balance when and how much, or how much thought we give to eating, or how much of our time is spent thinking about our investment portfolio, or those extra hours that we can pick up so that we can buy that thing we want to buy, but maybe we don't actually need. Like, all of that energy is energy that is being expended within the area of desire and resistance. And so if we're constantly fighting against desiring things with an outsized desire, or if we're spending energy, like real emotional energy, trying to resist the urge to buy that thing or eat that thing in a way that is sort of covering up our emotions, for example, all of that energy that we're expending managing complexity of desire and resistance could eventually be freed up to be directed at love of God and love of others. So the question is, how does this relate to spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation, this lens through which we're looking at our rule of life this year? One of the things that Ignatius says in his notes to spiritual directors leading people through the exercises is that when we find ourselves in spiritual desolation, one of the things to consider is whether or not we have fed our desires for what Ignatius calls lowly and earthly things. He says that one of the forms that spiritual desolation can take is that there is a downward attraction to these low and earthly things. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes we can use what we're drawn to as a sign or a signal for whether we are in spiritual consolation or spiritual desolation. So someone in spiritual consolation will be drawn to prayer and to the scriptures and to fellowship with others in spiritual friendship. And someone in spiritual desolation will be drawn to low and earthly things. They'll be drawn to more readily satisfying what the Apostle Paul calls the desires of the flesh. So these are the things like excess of material comfort or diversion of thought through technology or media, that sort of checking out feeling that we get sometimes when we're feeling a bit slothful or pursuing bodily comfort in ways that feel a bit excessive. Maybe we could put a complex relationship with clothing in that category. And so generally, when we talk about our commitment to simplicity in these 4 areas of food, clothing, possessions, and technology, we're generally asking you to consider the baseline setting of these areas of your life. Like, in an ongoing way, is my relationship with food and alcohol simple, or is it complex? But when we look through this lens of consolation and desolation, we might also be able to notice that we're in a season where our relationship to one or more of these things has just become more complex. Like maybe our desires right now feel a bit out of alignment with what they usually are. Like maybe we notice that we're self-medicating with food, or we're binge watching, or we're thumb scrolling. And maybe this is like not our baseline of our behavior, but it's just been the past month or the past season. Maybe what is actually happening is that you are in some spiritual desolation, and this is how the spiritual desolation is coming out sideways for you. So one of the reasons that we want to keep this commitment to simplicity is that when we can train ourselves toward a simple baseline relationship with these areas, it becomes easy to tell when we've entered into a season of desolation. And in a season of desolation, which is normal, by the way, Ignatius says that one of the things that might be happening is that God is leaving us to our own devices, as the saying goes, so that we can learn to resist the enemy and take initiative to fight against the things that are leading us away from the invitations of God in our life, which is where we find the presence of God. And in the presence of God is where we're reminded of God's love. And so for Ignatius, the desire for low and earthly things, the inordinate desire or lust for food or drink or riches, or even the act of remembering some past time when you were more indulgent in those things, this slight little draw, this gravity acting on you and pulling your desires into the things that can deaden your senses, all of this can be a sign that you are in or are entering into some spiritual desolation. And resistance to that pull can be the first step to partnering with God to orient you a bit out of that posture in a way that may be paired with some other activities and undergirded by the grace of God. By the way, it's always the grace of God that is at work in us. As we partner with God, we can be lifted out of that spiritual desolation. And so this month, I'd love to ask you to think about this commitment to simplicity and perhaps consider whether you're in a season or can remember a season where you were drawn to low and earthly things. I know that saying feels a bit weird. I just sort of love that phrase. But think about whether you are in a season where one or more of those areas have become more complex than perhaps they used to be. And consider in prayer or perhaps in spiritual direction whether you might be in a season of spiritual desolation. So if you have felt like maybe your faith or hope or desire to love feels a bit dry, and if you notice that you're being drawn to some things in a way that feels like a bit extra, or if your ability to resist the things that you just know pull you away from what God is doing in your life, you might be in some spiritual desolation.